March 1997. 39 bodies, identical Nikes, and a comet in the sky. They weren't seeking death, they were waiting for a spaceship. This is Heaven's Gate, where science fiction became a final exit. Welcome to real, unexplained events.
In March 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet streaked across the night sky like a frozen ghost, a silent departure was taking place in an upscale mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. Inside, 39 people lay on bunk beds, their bodies arranged with eerie military precision. They were dressed in identical black tunics and brand new Nike Decades, their faces covered by small purple shrouds. There was no sign of struggle, no smell of decay, only the sterile scent of an orderly exit. These were the members of Heaven's Gate, a group that believed they weren't dying but shedding their containers. To them, the comet wasn't a celestial event, it was a cosmic dinner bell, a sign that a spacecraft was trailing in its wake, ready to transport them to the next level of existence. It remains the largest mass suicide on American soil involving a non-traditional belief system, a chilling intersection of science fiction, spirituality, and the ultimate sacrifice for a destination that lay beyond the stars. The architecture of this cosmic delusion was built by Marshall Applewhite, known to his followers as Doe, and Bonnie Nettles, known as T. They met in the early 1970s and quickly bonded over a shared belief that they were the two witnesses mentioned in the Book of Revelation. Unlike the typical image of a gritty cult, Heaven's Gate was surprisingly sophisticated. They were pioneers of the early internet, running a successful web design business called Higher Source. Their theology was a unique blend of Christian eschatology and ufology, stripping away human emotion and biological identity to prepare for an extraterrestrial evolution. Members were required to lead a monastic lifestyle. They gave up their families, their possessions, and in some cases, even their gender through surgical castration. They viewed their bodies as mere vehicles that had to be maintained with clinical discipline until the moment of pickup. By the time Hale-Bopp appeared in the sky, the group had spent 20 years refining a mental cage that made the idea of leaving the Earth feel not like a tragedy, but like a long-awaited graduation. The final sequence of events began on March 22, 1997. The group recorded a series of exit videos which remain some of the most unsettling footage in criminal history. In them, members looked directly into the camera, smiling and expressing genuine joy about their impending departure. There is no coercion visible, only a hauntingly calm certainty. The suicide process was as methodical as their web coding. They divided into 3 shifts over 3 days. They mixed phenobarbital into bowls of applesauce or pudding, washed it down with vodka, and then tied plastic bags over their heads to ensure the process was completed. Each member carried a $5 bill and 3 quarters in their pockets, a symbolic interplanetary toll for their journey. The precision was chilling. They died in waves so that the survivors could clean up after the deceased, ensuring that the mansion remained a pristine portal for their souls. When the final 2 members completed the ritual, they left behind a house of silence that would soon shock the world and redefine our understanding of how high-intelligence individuals can be led into a total eclipse of reason. The discovery of the bodies was as surreal as the cult's theology. On March 26, 1997, a former member named Rio D'Angelo, who had left the group months earlier but remained on good terms, received a FedEx package. Inside were 2 VHS tapes and a letter stating that the group had gone. When he entered the mansion using his key, he was met with a stillness that felt heavy and intentional. He moved from room to room, finding the members in their perfectly made beds, their matching outfits giving them the appearance of a unified crew on a long-range mission. He didn't find a scene of carnage, but a dormitory of the dead. D'Angelo immediately called 911, reporting that there were many bodies and that it looked like a religious mass suicide. When the San Diego County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they initially suspected a gas leak or a chemical attack due to the eerie uniformity of the scene. It wasn't until they began lifting the purple shrouds and finding the Heaven's Gate away team patches on their shoulders that the true cosmic nature of the tragedy began to unfold. The investigation into Marshall Applewhite, the man at the center of the Vortex, revealed a tragic history of mental instability and repressed identity. Following the death of his partner, Bonnie Nettles, in 1985, Applewhite's grip on reality began to slip further. He told his followers that T had merely returned to the spacecraft and was waiting for them to join her. This grief-driven narrative became the foundation for the group's final decade. Applewhite was not a charismatic firebrand like Jim Jones. He was soft-spoken, bug-eyed, and paternal, using a slow, methodical style of indoctrination. Forensic psychologists who analyzed his later tapes described him as a man deeply afraid of the human condition, seeking a way to transcend biological desires. He convinced his followers that their bodies were earthly containers or human plants that had reached the end of their harvest. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate was that its members weren't looking for death, they were looking for an evolution. They followed a man who had successfully convinced them that the most extreme act of self-destruction was actually the ultimate act of self-preservation. The Nike decades, the specific model of shoes worn by every member, became an accidental icon of the tragedy. Investigation into the cult's logistics showed that Applewhite had purchased the shoes in bulk because he liked the uniformity and managed to get a good deal. This detail highlights the bizarrely mundane aspects of the group's existence. They were professional, tax-paying citizens who ran one of the most successful web design firms in San Diego. They used the money they earned to pay the $7,000 monthly rent on the Rancho Santa Fe mansion and to buy top-of-the-line computer equipment. This normalcy is what made the cult so effective and so dangerous. There were no barbed wire fences, no armed guards, and no physical coercion. The members were free to leave at any time, and yet the psychological walls Applewhite built were more impenetrable than any prison. They spent their days meticulously coding websites for local businesses while simultaneously preparing for a rendezvous with an alien mothership. It was a dual existence, one foot in the digital frontier of the 21st century and the other in a fantasy of cosmic salvation. The role of the Hale-Bopp comet in the group's demise cannot be overstated. By late 1996, the comet was becoming visible to the naked eye, a spectacular omen that Applewhite interpreted as the final sign. The investigation found that the group had even purchased a high-powered telescope to catch a glimpse of the companion craft they believed was hidden in a comet's tail. When they couldn't see the ship, they didn't question their faith. Instead, they returned the telescope to the shop, claiming it was defective. This refusal to acknowledge reality, even when presented with scientific proof, is the hallmark of total indoctrination. To the members of Heaven's Gate, the comet was a literal open door. They believed the window for graduation was narrow, and that if they didn't leave their bodies while the comet was at its peak, they would be left behind on a recycling Earth. The countdown was on, and as the comet grew brighter in the California sky, the atmosphere inside the mansion became one of ecstatic preparation for what they believed was the greatest journey in human history. The aftermath of the discovery turned the quiet suburbs of Rancho Santa Fe into a media circus. As investigators removed the bodies, the world struggled to reconcile the image of the away team with the reality of a mass casualty event. The toxicology reports confirmed that the cause of death was a lethal dose of phenobarbital mixed with alcohol, followed by suffocation. There were no victims in the traditional sense, there were no signs of struggle, and every person had died voluntarily. However, the investigation into the survivors, the few who had been told to stay behind to maintain the website and spread the message, revealed the deep psychological scarring of the group's philosophy. Even after the bodies were gone and the house was cleared, these survivors continued to maintain the original Heaven's Gate website, which remains active to this day as a digital tombstone. They didn't see a crime, they saw a successful mission. This unwavering commitment, even in the face of 39 corpses, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, proving that the cult's exit was not just a physical act, but a total cognitive departure from the human race. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate is often dismissed as a bizarre footnote in the history of the 90s, but the human cost was profound. Families of the members were left with a void that could never be filled, struggling to understand how their loved ones, many of whom were gifted artists, musicians, and technicians, could vanish into a belief system that demanded their very lives. The investigation revealed that many members had been with Applewhite for decades, slowly severing all ties to their past. They weren't crazy in the clinical sense. They were people searching for meaning in a world they found hollow, and Applewhite provided a structure that made sense to them. The ultimate irony of the case is that the Hale-Bopp comet continued its journey through the solar system, indifferent to the lives sacrificed in its name. There was no spacecraft, no next level, and no pickup, just a quiet house on a hill and 39 people who died waiting for a ship that never came, victims of a celestial misunderstanding that was as ancient as the stars and as modern as a computer screen. Today, the mansion in Rancho Santa Fe has been demolished, its foundations erased to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid pilgrimage. But the story of Heaven's Gate continues to haunt our understanding of belief and manipulation. It remains a case study in how the internet can facilitate the isolation of a group, creating an echo chamber where even the most radical ideas become normalized. As we look back at the images of the purple shrouds and the black Nikes, we are reminded of the terrifying power of a shared narrative. Heaven's Gate was not a cult of violence, but a cult of total, unwavering conviction. A group that stepped into the dark with a smile, believing they were heading toward the light. Their departure serves as a grim monument to the search for belonging, showing that in the quest for the infinite, the human spirit can sometimes lose its way so completely that even death looks like a doorway to the stars. The comet has long since vanished from our sky, but the silence of that house in 1997 still echoes as a warning of what happens when we stop looking at the Earth and start living for a ghost ship in the tail of a star.
39 souls, one shared delusion, and a void left behind. Was it a search for the infinite or just a tragic loss of the self? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you're fascinated by the mysteries the world tries to forget, hit that subscribe button and join us. This is Real Unexplained Events. Stay vigilant.